All right. Hello again. Brandon coming to you, and this is going to be part 2 in a series I'm doing here on painting trees. Part 1 was a little bit of how to do some trees very quickly with not a lot of detail for either backgrounds or what you want to do. Part 2 here, I'm going to focus in on actually looking at tree trunks. So, if you have to do some close foreground trees that you're going to have some detail in the tree trunks, or you're focusing on a tree for your painting and you want to do some tree trunk work, we're going to look at that in this video. I've got a couple of different things that I have done in the past. If you have a look at that painting there, I've got a tree trunk there of a pine tree in the foreground. So we'll have a look at how I do my pine trees and the bark detail. If you have a look at this large painting here, this is a big giant canvas here of the angel oak. So it's a big giant 500-year-old oak tree. We take a look at some of the detail on the oak tree. There's different bark texture and detail going on here. So to have a look at my process of doing that, let's go. Okay, we're going to have a look here at my process of doing a couple different types of tree trunk texture, bark texture, whatever you want to call it. And the three most common ones that I deal with are going to be pine trees with that kind of bark, and then maybe some oak trees or some hardwoods like that. And then the third one would be trees, maybe like a birch tree or other kind of hardwood that the bark is much more of a papery kind of consistency that's wrapped around the tree itself. So I'm going to be using really just two brushes for this. I got two different angled brushes. This is like a 1-inch angled brush and a little 1/4 inch. And so for the pine tree that I do, first thing I'm going to do is just lay in a dark tree trunk of mostly black and brown. I just run a really dark brown value to start out with. So I just mix a little bit of something like raw umber with some black and create my tree trunk. Or at least my starting point for my tree trunk anyway. And again, all we're looking for here is a really dark brown value, because we're going to be bringing our other highlights in on top of that. Now, I'm going to stick with this large brush for the time being, and my first pass of creating some different values in there is going to be, I'm going to add just a touch of something like yellow ochre to the mix that lightens it up a little bit. And I'm still working with this same brown and black that I just laid in there. But now I'm going to take my angle brush and I'm going to turn it on end. And I'm just going to use the end of that brush to tap in a little bit of a bark texture, I guess you would call that. And again, all I did was slightly lighten that mix up with just a little bit of some yellow ochre. And that's just to break up that original really dark background that I'm dealing with there, to start to add a little bit of character to our tree trunk. Now we're going to move to our smaller brush to do the rest of this. So I'm going to continue to work in raw umber for the most part here, and I'm going to add a little bit of red to this mix. It doesn't take a lot of red, but I want to redden it up a little bit on my tree trunk when I start adding in this bark. And I'm going to add a touch of like neutral gray to this to lighten it up, and I want to see what I've got here now. That's pretty good. So on this smaller brush here, I'm going to basically use the end and I'm going to start tapping in some individual bark shapes on this tree. And then I'm going to lighten that value up a little bit with just a touch more, maybe some yellow ochre in there, and then a hint of some titanium white. And as I lighten up my values, I work mostly towards the center of this tree, if we're saying we have a light source that's coming from the front here. So I leave the left and the right edges dark for the most part. And so again, I am just now making some individual bark shapes with this brush. And then one more to the mix, a little bit more of some neutral gray thrown in there, maybe a touch more of the titanium white thrown in there. And we'll really start to focus in on some of these individual bark pieces now that we drop our even lighter value in here on. And again, I work more towards the center of this tree now, keeping my edges dark if we're saying that our light source is coming from the front. And then the last step that I would do on here is just one last lightening pass with maybe a little bit more titanium white in the mix for a highlight, and literally hitting just the edges of some of these individual pieces of bark that I have created to put in just a little highlight along the edges of these pieces. And obviously I would continue that process down the whole trunk of this tree. I'm focusing in on just this one little area here for y'all to see at the moment. But that right there would create, in essence, nice tree bark texture for something like a pine tree. You could also do limbs, obviously, that way. Now, if we're talking about doing something more like an oak tree, like you saw at the beginning here, my big oak that I did, it's a very similar process. I just change up my colors a little bit, so I don't go into much of the brown here as I do stick with my grays. So I'm going to make a tree trunk with mostly starting with black, maybe a little bit of neutral gray mixed into it to create a dark basically another dark tree trunk that we're going to be working with. Now with oak trees, you could get a variety of colors mixed in there. You could get some greens and a lot of different variations of grays and even some browns here and there depending on the oak tree. So for this purpose, let's go into some more of the gray value here and maybe a hint of some brown with this larger brush. And so again, I'll take the end of this here and start to create individual bark texture yet again on this tree. Now, a lot of times with oak trees, you don't get the chunkier thicker bark, you get more of longer, skinnier type bark on there. So I make more of these small little lines with this brush. And again, all I've done is come in here with a little bit of gray. Maybe a hint of some raw umber in there. Alright, now I'm going to switch back over to my smaller brush, and depending on what you want to do, what kind of character you want to add again to your oak tree or your hardwoods here, because some of these will have different mosses and things. So let's just move into a little bit of, let's add some green to the mix here. And we're still dealing with gray, maybe a touch of black in here to darken this first pass up. And it might not even be easy to see on the camera at this point, but this is bringing in some green into this mix, that when you look at this up close in person, you can see some green starting to come through. And again, I'm making more longer, skinnier pieces of bark here in the case of this particular hardwood. And now as I lighten my value up some more, we'll do a little bit more gray in the mix, maybe a hint of titanium white in here. And then keeping in with these longer linear pieces of bark texturing in here. And again, depending on where your light source was coming from, that's the direction that you'd be putting most of your highlights. So for this purpose, we're just saying our light source is coming from somewhere in front of us, or shining onto this tree from the front here. So I'm keeping my highlights, the brightest stuff, towards the center of this tree. And then again, one last pass with a little bit more of the titanium white in the mix, and really just kind of highlight some individual edges of some little linear pieces of this bark texture in there. And so there you have essentially pine tree dealing with a little fatter, wider bark that's got some red into it, browns and reds. You've got more oak hardwood here, skinnier, linear bark that's got grays and greens mixed in. The last one we'll do here is, again, some of these hardwoods that have a more papery kind of bark wrapping on the tree, something like a birch maybe. We'll do one more dark tree trunk here. Again, mostly some raw umber and some black mixed in. So for this one, I'm going to continue with my larger brush, because we're going to be bringing in this papery bark texture, essentially wrapping it from the sides. So we're going to lighten up a mix here with some gray and some of the black initially, come in along the edge of our dark tree trunk and make a little bit of a slightly down curved shaping brush stroke as we bring in that color along the edge of this tree, giving the appearance that we have a rounded tree trunk here that we're dealing with. And it's okay to have your color not overly mixed on your brush at this point, so you get a little bit of that variation. And so if you're going to bring it in from the other side, it's kind of the same thing. You just a little bit of a downward turn, creating the idea that we have a rounded object we're dealing with here. Now in the midsection here, if we're going to keep with our theme of where our light source is coming from, we'll just lighten up our value a tad bit. And again, it's okay to have it kind of modeled on your brush a little bit here, so it's not overly mixed, so you get that streaky kind of effect. Now with our smaller angled brush, we'll come in here and detail out however we want. So if you want to put in pieces of brighter bark areas like this, you can, leaving gaps and spaces obviously in it, because again with this kind of tree bark texture, nothing is going to be uniform. There's going to be spaces, dark areas, light areas, all kinds of stuff going on in here. And you can always come back with some dark pieces. If it were something like a birch tree, let's say, and create, darker lines and cuts in on some of these pieces of bark. We could take basically just black and come in here and drop in random places where our bark is showing, maybe where it's curled up, breaking apart from the tree or something like that. So there's a pretty quick tutorial of how I'm creating different tree trunk bark texture. We have essentially what I would do for a pine there on the left, more like a hardwood oak in the middle, and then something with the papery bark there on the right. Hope you guys enjoyed this one in the tree series. If you want to check out the first one, it's already up on the page. Give me a like and subscribe if you want to see some more videos. I'll have another tree series video coming out shortly. Until next time, happy painting, everybody.